From there. Okay, welcome. Hi, everybody. Hi, Taylor. My name's Simon. As of Monday, I'm the director of data analytics, WordPress.com. As always, super stoked to be here hosting another Ask Me Anything session with the locally optimistic community. Today, I'm super glad to be welcoming Taylor Murphy. Taylor, hello. Welcome. I'm really excited about this. I feel like you and I have got so much to talk about. So let's get started. Can you just kind of introduce yourself? We can do the cocktail party intro and take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So Taylor Murphy, as you said, super glad to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm a staff data engineer at GitLab. I've been at GitLab for about a year and a half now, and I've been in kind of the data management, data engineering, data scientist space, whatever you want to call it, for over 5 years, 5 or 6 years now. So that's the 10-second pitch.
So tell me about your own journey, your personal journey. Like we know where you are now. So where did you start and sort of
Yeah.
what happened in the middle? I mean, tell me the story of your story.
Sure. Yeah. So my background actually is in chemical engineering. My bachelor's degree is chemical engineering, and then after undergrad, I felt like I wasn't a good enough engineer, so I was like, I'm going to go to grad school and get more education because that's what you need to do. So I went to grad school in the biomolecular and chemical and biomolecular engineering department at Vanderbilt. That's what it was. And so it was like I joined a lab there that was doing research on cancer metabolism. So like applying chemical engineering practices to this classic cancer biology field. And that was when I started getting more into like what you could do with computers, because half my work was wet work, like working in the lab, dealing with cells,
Hmm.
doing a lot of cell culture, which thankfully I hopefully never have to do. And then also analyzing all of that data. So the techniques that we were using were just generating a lot of data. I did a lot of data modeling in MATLAB, trying to kind of predict internal cellular processes based on the data that we were gathering. Um, After grad school, I was kind of networking around town and met the person who would hire me at a company called NextGXDX. It was a small startup here in Nashville, Tennessee. They hired me as a data scientist
Hmm.
because that was 2013. Data scientist was in vogue. Like, oh, you got a PhD and you can deal with data. You must be a data scientist, right?
Of course.
Um, in reality, it was more like a very hybrid data analyst, engineering, management kind of role. The company was focused on the genetic testing market. And so we were doing things like scraping genetic testing websites for all of their products. And then my role was to kind of aggregate all that information, do a lot of entity reconciliation, parsing out what are the targets, the techniques of these different products, and then creating like the world's largest database of genetic testing products. Um, and we built a lot of tooling around that, which was a lot of fun. So a lot of time with JavaScript, Python. I got really, really good at regular expressions, which is fun.
Yeah.
And I also had the opportunity to work with some really awesome engineers kind of on the development side. About 4.5 years into that, just kind of started looking for a new job, felt a little bit restless, wanted to stretch my wings, as it were. Um, and I was applying for a lot of companies. Mainly, I wanted to work remotely because Nashville is very like healthcare focused, and I wanted to get out of healthcare. Um,
Totally.
yeah, I got lucky and got hired by GitLab as a data engineer. But what really and kind of now how I tell the story is like GitLab was great because I was able to GitLab's really good at DevOps. Like our product is all around DevOps. And having worked with some awesome engineers at the my previous company, which I rebranded to Concert Genetics. So at Concert, we had they're just awesome engineers using these tools that I was kind of using, but they had all these kind of DevOps processes. I'm like, we need some of that stuff on the data team. And so coming to GitLab was a great opportunity to be involved in kind of the DevOps space and see how we could bring these tools to data teams. Yeah, so I joined in January of 2018 as a data engineer. 2 months in, my manager quit, and then I was directly reporting to the CFO. And I was like, this
Oh,
is not the right level of abstraction for you. So how about I manage the team? Because that's at the end of my tenure at Concert, my title was director of data operations. I was like, I can manage a data team. Like I can help grow. I don't want to do this forever. So made that transition, hired a bunch of people. In May of this year, transitioned back to the IC world as a staff data engineer, and that's kind of where we're at now.
Right on.
Yeah.
So, whoa, lots going on here, right? So talk to me a little bit about, thinking back to kind of your early days in like the heady, like nascent days of what it even was to be a data scientist, right? And what that work looked like, right? And what tools you used and what kind of like language you used. And then
Hmm.
just compare that to kind of how you're working today and sort of how those are different and like what that kind of journey has been like.
Yeah. I think since my training is very much as an engineer, I've always been drawn more to kind of operations and infrastructure, and I would always kind of keep an eye out on the cool, like sexy data science things and all the predictive models that people were working with, and it seemed cool, but it never seemed applicable to the problems that I was actually solving on kind of a day-to-day basis. We had some instances at Concert where like maybe we could apply a machine learning model, but you know what, like Elasticsearch worked just fine. Back when I started, we were on Redshift, and we were getting like a lot of claims data in, and just doing the usual. Like we had a couple SQL scripts, would kind of run those if we needed to run them on a job. We would maybe use cron. I was doing a lot of ad hoc analyses and Jupyter notebooks, but there was never like any good consistent process. There was no mechanism for code review or anything like that.
Sure.
And we had built some custom tooling as well for managing all this data that we were scraping, which that was pretty cool. I found that as like there was no tool that was out there that I found that would help us do exactly what we needed to do, which was basically parse a bunch of HTML, extract all these very specific entities that needed to have a high degree of accuracy, and do that on a repeatable process where we're scraping like hundreds of websites every week, and we have a high confidence in our data. Um, yeah. So kind of started with Redshift, and been very much into that, and then kind of look over the fence and see like they're using Worker, and I was like, what is that? What is your build process like? Like I didn't even understand these things. And I think coming to GitLab, like we have a pretty cool product for that, and you just kind of get like merge requests and kind of this whole all-in-one kind of platform kind of out of the box. And it's like, okay, now how can I use this and kind of apply that to my day-to-day work? Does that answer your question, I think?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And what does that look like, right? When you think of, 'cause you've mentioned this idea of DevOps, right? And sort of
Mhm.
engineering practices of software engineers, which is how I interpret that. I hope that's what it means.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're sort of suggesting that there's a lot of problems or hurdles or situations in data organizations that could be well served, like with this adjacent tool set. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. And honestly, like a lot of this, I'm very heavily involved in the DBT community as well. And so Tristan Handy has some great opinions on this stuff and how the work of analysts is really transitioning more towards engineering. Maybe that shows his engineering bias a little bit, but a lot of the work that people are doing as analysts kind of have strong overlaps. You're generating code,
Yeah.
a lot of SQL. You're generating dashboards, which are probably a mix of SQL or Python. And then you run into the same problems. You want to understand what was the history of this code? What was I running previously? And so it's like, well, okay, let's use some version control. And then there's already tools, GitLab, GitHub, that allow you to, have merge requests, pull requests to merge in a different branch. And so it's like, okay, well, we can start using that. One thing that we were very interested in when I joined was how can we use GitLab CI because we were already on DBT when I joined. How can we
Yeah.
use GitLab CI to really make kind of a repeatable, testable process for merging our code into production? When I first joined, we were actually using Postgres as our data warehouse because we were dealing with very small data volumes, Salesforce, NetSuite, Dora. Like you don't need a full-blown data warehouse for some of these things. So we were actually on Postgres on Google's Cloud SQL, and we first started testing out there. Every time we made a new branch in Git, it would actually make a clone, an entire clone of the data warehouse. That obviously doesn't scale, but it actually worked really well in Cloud SQL because you could programmatically interact with the database. And
Right.
so our DBT jobs that would run in the merge request would run against the clone. Once kind of all of our tests passed and DBT was happy, we would merge that clone would get torn down, and then go into production. That gets expensive real quick, but when we moved to Snowflake, Snowflake has an awesome feature called zero copy clones. So we have the exact same thing, but it's much, much cheaper. And so now every time in a merge request, your code's running against that clone, and it gets destroyed when we merge it into production. And so it's like, it's a very nice thing that now we don't even have to think about it. Just kind of, it's all set up. But now we can like run those jobs as many times as we want. It works really well.
So thinking about like computational expense and thinking about version control, and like what are some other things that like we as data professionals can, I don't want to say steal. Like in what ways would we be well served to imitate like successful engineering organizations?
Yeah, I think that's a question that I'm still trying to understand. I struggle personally with the balance of there's so much work to do as an analyst that I sometimes don't have time to kind of look over the fence at what my peers are doing. But one of the nice things about working at GitLab is everybody uses the product, and it's really cool to with the new features that come out, and we're very open internally and externally about what's going on. I can kind of take a peek and see like, oh, what's going on over there, or how are they using this feature. What I can say is I don't know. There's nothing off the top of my head that like, oh, I know engineers are doing this, and I want to be, bring that over. But
Yeah.
things that I think about is I would love to have kind of an all-in-one system for tracking everything that's going on with my data infrastructure. And we kind of have that right now because it's very heavily invested in dbt, but we use Stitch for a lot of our ingestion, and that's not really tied to the code base. It's separate, and it's kind of hard to see where maybe some changes are going. Now,
Right.
we use Periscope, which has Git integration, but it's in a separate repository. There's no merge request workflow around that. For me, like an awesome ideal state is a merge request that comes in to maybe add a new column in Salesforce or rename something, does a couple of transformations in dbt, and then I can see how that's going to affect dashboards and Periscope, and it's all kind of in one merge request, or at least in like a merge train of merge requests that are happening. I very biased in thinking about things from that perspective and that kind of change control perspective. Yeah, I think too, like just having access to a good CI platform has been really great as well. And we are trying to solve this a little bit. There's I don't know if it's been mentioned elsewhere, but there's this Meltano product that we're working on internally, which is kind of like what GitLab is to DevOps engineers or engineering teams. Meltano would be for data teams.
Oh, interesting.
We're not, the data team at GitLab is not actually a customer of Meltano, just because Meltano is such an early product, and we've got a lot of operational needs and business needs that we have to meet. But we're kind of contributing to that product and watching them with great interest too.
It's so interesting to think about your journey, your professional journey, to me at least, and especially in talking to folks around the locally optimistic community and Twitter and all that, because it feels like, starting as a frontline analyst or data scientist, and, finding yourself in a position where you are, reporting directly to a C-suite executive, and you're building a team and sort of laying out strategy. That kind of feels like the dream, right? It feels like a lot of folks are kind of trying to pursue that path. And it's really interesting to me to hear that the next chapter for you was then to sort of return to an individual contributor role. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of what that experience has been like?
Yeah. There was a great blog post about this, and I can't remember the name, but I can send a link after the
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Right. But the author, she talks a lot about the switch from manager to IC, and that being promoted to manager is not necessarily a promotion; it's actually a different career track. For me, joining a small startup originally at Concert, I was the 10th employee of the company. We never got beyond 30 employees, and so it was very small. I got a great understanding of what was going on in the company, and in general, like I've always been part of small teams, small universities, small research labs, things like that. So I'm pretty happy there, and I'm kind of biased towards small teams, I think, which allows you just have to learn so much because there's not enough hands to do everything, and everybody, there's enough smaller people you can know kind of what's going on. The data team at Concert kind of grew out around me. There was kind of a director of data science or VP of analytics, whatever his title was. He hired me as the person who's actually doing the work, and then he kind of moved on to a more like a customer services or client services kind of role, and the data team kind of grew out around me. And so that's where I got some of my management chops. And I found myself in a position where I knew a lot kind of about what the company needed, what Concert needed, and I gained certain skill sets. But taking a step back of like, where do I really love this kind of data management space. I think I have some skill in it and I want to get better. I've never had any formal training as a computer scientist or anything like that. And for me, it was a desire to train some of those technical chops more. But also too, I knew my wife and I were expecting, and like managing people and then having a kid can be challenging. And so I was like, I need to be a little bit selfish in my career, and I want to be an individual contributor. Now, of course, life throws wrenches at you, and like 2 months into my IC career, they needed a manager, and so I was like, okay, this is what the company needs. I can do this, as long as it's kind of temporary. But I was having a lot of conversations of like, this isn't the path I want to be on right now. I'm happy to do it for the short term. And thankfully, I have a great boss who's able to help me make that transition. But I fully see myself going back into management at some point, kind of hopefully at the director level, for mid-sized organization probably. But I really just want to spend some time being heavily involved in the community. I'm really happy when I can just put my headphones on and code for 4 hours straight.
Sure.
And so I have just been fortunate enough to make that transition back to IC.
Right. And when you say like being heavily involved in the community, like what does that mean to you? What community are you referring to?
Yeah. The data community, anybody who loves data, anybody who wants to move into this space, joining GitLab when I did, my boss at the time had found DBT and started getting interested in it. And I was like, okay, I'll join the Slack community and see what's going on here. And then you talk to people and you use the product and you're like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And then GitLab being a very open and transparent company, it's created more opportunities than I thought for engagement with other people, because there's been nothing like, hey, yeah, we use DBT, it's great, and here's a link to our documentation and our code base of exactly how we implement it. And it's great for asking questions. I can post something in the support channel. It's like, hey, here's the merge request I'm working on. I can't get this to work. Anybody have any ideas? And so it because we're so open, it invites people in.
Yeah.
And then for us, it's been great. Like if I have some downtime or whatever, I'll hop on the Slack channel, see if anybody asks any questions that I know an answer to, and I'll just say, oh yeah, you need to do X, Y, Z. Here's how we implemented it. Cool. So the DBT community is great. Locally Optimistic has been great as well, just for knowledge share. I asked when I was managing the team, a very specific question I asked, it was, what percentage of your organization is data? And I said, just lump in everybody who's a data analyst, engineer, data scientist, or manager. It was really interesting because the data I got back was anywhere from 2 to about 6% of most organizations are data people, data oriented, data focused. Sure. And GitLab has been not at that 2% level. And for me, that was a wake up call. I was like, oh man, we're a bit understaffed. But we've been able to keep up kind of with the workload a bit, I think, because of some of the practices that we put into place and how overall as an organization operationally mature we are, because we have such a culture of documentation and change management. So that stuff like that has just been fantastic. I just have a direct connection to amazing people who, if I were just to focus on Nashville, I wouldn't have access to.
Right. Yeah. And do you feel like this culture, you describe GitLab as being organizationally very mature. Do you feel like that is associated with the fully remote aspects? Do you think it's independent? Like, what's your sense of that?
I think it's absolutely driven by that. What sold me, you work at Automatic, so I'm preaching the choir to you, but what sold me on kind of the remote philosophy is that for most every organization at a certain scale, you're remote and you just don't realize it. You have people working on different floors, if you have people working on different buildings, even if they're in the same location, you are basically remote at that point, and most of your interactions are going to happen via email or some other system. And if you don't have the practices in place to overcome that remoteness or make it easier, it can be challenging. And so from the start, our CEO, I think about once they were 10 people, it's like, we're just going to go all in on this remote thing. And that immediately raises questions about how you want to communicate.
Right.
If you don't make a decision about how you want to do that, people are going to figure out their own way to do it, and like subcultures are going to form. I think one of our greatest assets is our handbook. Most everything about our organization is documented in the handbook, from practices and procedures and how we do things. And the data team part of the handbook is a great point of pride for the team, I think, because it just shows like this is how we work. And if somebody doesn't like how we're working, like make a merge request, let's discuss it. And we're merging, I would say, tens of changes a week or at least a month into our handbook to document the current state of what we're doing. So I think it's absolutely driven by the remote culture. And I'd be hard pressed to work at another company that does not have something similar in place, because it makes so many conversations easy. When you're trying to get a CXO, your CEO, CFO, CMO, whoever, to agree on some KPI, you can say, here's the merge request. We need to define it this way. Here's the weird corner case because the Salesforce data is done this way. Do you agree? They merge it. So now you have buy-in from that stakeholder, and now you can tie that into the dashboard that you're working on. So everybody has agreement on definitions, and it just makes conversations so much easier. Not to say that there aren't challenges, but it's in my experience so far, it's kind of like obviated just a whole class of communication problems, I think.
It's really interesting. I mean, you're really describing things that I think for a lot of organizations are kind of invisible and implicit, and that you're sort of forcing them to be both visible and explicit.
Exactly. Yes.
That like some part of me feels like that's a little scary, right? Like there's so much responsibility and like way more accountability is what it feels like. Do people rise to that? Do people kind of shy away from it? What does that look like culturally?
I think when you join the company, you kind of have an understanding of what you're getting into.
Yeah.
A lot of I think for the first month or so, I had a little bit of anxiety about like, every bit of work that I'm doing, like you can go to my public profile now and see the comments that I'm making on public issues. Like most of our issues are public. And you eventually just kind of get over it. Like for me, I've turned it into an asset now. It's just, I work out in the open, and if I'm doing something that I wouldn't want to be public, maybe I shouldn't
do it. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It for me, it just encourages, more honesty, more empathy, better communication, a little bit more thoughtfulness about what's going on. Of course, we still have like internal Slack communications and things like that, but we explicitly call out, like, if you're making a decision, like the decision doesn't belong in Slack, it belongs in the handbook. And in fact, we've implemented a retention policy around Slack. So after 90 days, all your messages get deleted, which at first I was against, but now I'm like, this is great. Let's do 30 days because just having that all-time record actually isn't that useful or
yeah.
like,
yeah, we have sort of similar. It's not encoded in a retention policy, but we have a really similar cultural sort of moray, right? To get things into an asynchronous format, especially, I don't know what y'all's time zone spread is, but a lot of our colleagues are all over the world. Yeah. So.
Yeah, we have 45 countries at this point, I think.
So it's so big.
It's awesome.
Oh my gosh.
It's been great too. Just like joining this company, I'm suddenly connected to such a diverse group of people that I Nashville has people from different places in the country and in the world. And in college, I was able to connect with more of those people. But at concert, like, it was just everybody lived in Nashville, and we all had kind of a Nashville bias, which isn't a bad thing. But coming to GitLab, I'm able to talk to people in France and Africa and India and Australia, and it's super cool. It's really cool.
Yeah, for sure. That it's such an asset, and it's something that you wouldn't even be aware you're lacking, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a purely co-located office. Talk to me about the data organization that you are a part of now. Where does it sit within the company? Do you like have an analysis and an engineering split? Just give me the blueprint of like what it looks like.
Yeah, so it's going through a major transition right now. When I stepped out of the management role, there really was no managerial backfill right at that point in time. And so everybody in the organization was reporting to the director of business operations. As the organization's been growing, he's been heavily focused on kind of the IT ops side of the house. And the data team's been small enough that everybody was kind of self-organizing and self-managing. We're now making a transition. It's like it's clearly we need some more managers and a little bit better organization around priorities and things like that. Just communication across the organization, because you shouldn't have every analyst having to talk to VPs about priority with different things. It just takes away from them doing what they're good at. So we've made a recent data manager hire. She's awesome. She's still kind of in the onboarding process. And we've got a rec open for kind of like a director level role as well, though I think that may be on pause for a little bit as we kind of figure out what's going on with the manager and making sure that they're comfortable.
Yeah.
But we definitely want to hire a bunch more analysts. We've got currently 3 data engineers, myself included, 4 or 5 analysts, and then like I said, we want to hire a bunch more. We sit under finance, so like I mentioned, I originally reported the CFO, but now it goes me, data manager, director of business operations, CFO, CEO.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I think also kind of maybe the next follow-up question is our analysts we kind of have a mix of core analysts who can kind of maybe jump around between different data sources and questions, but we also have functionally specific analysts. So we have a couple of growth analysts who are focused specifically on the growth team needs. We have a financial data analyst come a financial. And then we also have on specific teams that aren't part of the data organization, but are like data adjacent, like a marketing operations person who has learned SQL and interacts with our team a lot. And
cool.
He uses DBT. So I think we've been really pushing for kind of a hub and spoke model overall. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah. Do you feel like, this is something that seems like there's a little bit of a split in sort of the way organizations approach it. Y'all have got sort of a core, you've got your analysts and engineers sort of sitting together with sort of areas of expertise. And it seems like many organizations sort of pluck those folks out and place them in finance, right? Or in growth or marketing. What's your sense of that trade-off? Do you feel like if the folks in your company were, actually seated with the growth team, like would that have a functional difference, or would that just be like an org chart change?
I think it would have a difference. The reason we really advocated for keeping the specialty analysts on the data team is primarily for their career growth.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily make sense for actually like the growth team is a great example. It's a new team that GitLab has started this year, and it's actually like there's 4 areas like activation, upsell, retention, and one other I can't remember. And there's PMs, product managers, kind of over those different areas. The PM for growth isn't really going to be able to help a data analyst that's working on that team to help them accelerate their career and understand where they want to go, unless that analyst really has aspirations to be kind of a product manager eventually. Like the growth team overall, I think is a UX person, 1 or 2 software engineers, a data analyst, and maybe 1 other person. And each of those roles kind of reports into their own group, like the UX group or the engineering group. And a lot of that's for all the benefits that you get being part of a team: knowledge share, career growth, understanding, how here's how I work with my PM. What's it like working with your PM, or what's it like working with the FP&A lead? Things like that. But the one thing I'm not 100% clear on is kind of like how the headcount is truly allocated. In our case, I think the growth data analysts are reporting to the manager of data, but I think maybe that their headcount comes from the growth team, which maybe is a weird dynamic, just because like managing to like performance and things like that. But also with that, the general priorities of a growth analyst would be set by the growth PM, saying like the PM's like, these are the questions that I have, and the role of the data managers is to really make sure they're learning and growing and really happy with their job, I think.
Yeah, that seems like a good way to kind of split that need.
Yeah, we'll see how it scales. Like, I mean, it's small. I fully admit my biases that I'm more biased towards smaller organizations where this is less of a concern, and I don't have a ton of experience in large organizations. I do hear stories though of very siloed teams. And I think
Yeah.
that's what we want to avoid. We don't want to have I don't want to have a situation where a data analyst is just like, here's the 3 tables that you get. You have no knowledge of really where this is coming from, and you can't
Right.
contribute to making the platform better. And so I think our documentation and kind of the culture of just like, here's where everything is helps break down some of those barriers.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That sort of like default to just so much transparency to really kind of allow folks to get the information that they need independently, right?
Yeah,
In the language I've been using a lot these days is the idea of like autonomy and direction, right?
mm-hmm.
Like you've got to give people enough autonomy that they don't constantly require direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, and having basically everything documented is great. And I think one area where we see like a little bit of challenge with some of that autonomy is people who are maybe comfortable with SQL, is like say a PM who knows some SQL, and they go into Periscope and they see a bunch of different tables, and there's not as like tight an integration as I would like between like our DBT docs and what you see in Periscope. So it's a
Sure.
question of like, hey, which table do I go to query this? And so they'll probably pop into Slack and we can say, oh, here's the link to our documentation. This is also in the handbook. Here's some analyses kind of built on that. So we do play some role in kind of providing some of that context. But as long as all we're providing is like, oh, here's the link that you need. Here's the link that you need. Like that's not a bad state to be in because everything's
Yeah.
documented.
Oh yeah, it could be much worse.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, so you mentioned sort of when you first got hired on, it was at these okay, data scientists. Like here's a job title that means everything, and means nothing, right? And now you're in this position where y'all are hiring, and you're hiring in a day where we have more job titles, but it's not clear to me that we've got more clarity, especially across companies, like what any of these job titles do. How are
Yeah.
you going to hire? Like, how do you hire the right people? Like, how do you hire folks who are sufficiently technical but aren't like necessarily trying to become like software engineers? Like, how do you do that? It seems so hard.
it it is tough. Our best hires, just straight up, have come out of the DBT Slack community, um, and that certainly is like a smaller, biased sample of potential candidates. Like, hey, here's our stack. We heavily use DBT. If you want to use DBT, like, come apply. Having gone through a ton of resumes for the data analyst role, um, it's opened my mind to like what does it actually mean to be a data analyst like
Yeah,
currently in a lot of large organizations, and a lot of it is mostly interfacing with like business stakeholders, doing maybe writing a SQL query to get data out, and then you're maybe doing some manipulation in Excel or something like that. And you're right, like the requirements for being a data analyst at GitLab currently are much more technical. um, the way we've kind of handled that is, there's some cases where you need some functional expertise, and finding somebody with the technical expertise and the functional expertise is going to be that's kind of a unicorn. So you have to decide like what do you want to train people on,
yeah,
um, and for me the bar has really been kind of set around, all right, do you know and understand SQL really well? And by really well, I mean not like can you do a couple of joins and do you know what a subquery is? It's like, are you comfortable writing CTEs? Do you know how to do a window function? Do you understand what lag does and all these things? And I don't expect people to know it without looking it up. I still have to like I'm literally before this call I was like refreshing myself on how to do write a lag function
oh my gosh,
through the
yeah, just
documentation. But like
tattoo the Impala documentation on window functions right on my arm. Like I might as well just, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and the rest we can I feel like we can kind of teach, especially because I feel like we're trying to drag the industry a little bit into something more technical. And so it's like, okay, if you're not super familiar with Git or version control or the command line, like those are teachable, but can you think relationally? Do you know how to interact with the rest of the business? And that's kind of where my head's at around the data analyst role. Data engineer role in particular is weird because that means a lot of things to a lot of different people for sure. We're not doing what I would consider like true like big data. We use Snowplow for event tracking, and so that's in the hundreds of gigs. But even that, like when you're using Snowflake, it's very manageable. So we're not using Kafka. We're not doing like a ton of real time streaming or anything like that. It's a lot of like batch based data engineering things. So I haven't thought too much about this because I've only hired one data engineer, and he came with a lot of Airflow background, and I knew we wanted to implement Airflow. And then the other data engineer, she moved over from the analyst side. So
Hmm.
I will be thinking more about this as our new manager kind of comes on board and wants to hire more. But it's tough. And then there's the whole like analytics engineer thing, right?
Right.
We had opened up I kind of made a merge request proposal to add that as a role, and the decision was to kind of simplify it down to data engineer with a specialty in analytics, but
Yeah.
we may be revisiting that actually pretty soon.
Yeah. I think, I think right now there probably are a lot of good to great analytic engineers rolling around out there, but they don't know that they are, like
Yeah.
it's such a new term. I think probably it doesn't have a lot of resonance outside of, locally optimistic or the DBT communities.
Yeah.
You mentioned how it feels like, at least in companies like the companies that we work for and I think are well represented in locally optimistic, that this analytics function is really starting to get like tugged more technical, right? Like you can't get away with not knowing SQL anymore. I think probably you're not going to be able to get away with not knowing like how to do a scripting language of some kind, right? Like if you open the DBT docs and it inspires like a lot of like anxiety in you for the first time, like that's going to be a problem. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where is that coming from? Like, what do you think the cause? It's okay. So let me set a little more context here because it kind of feels like the ability for a non-technical person to do pretty technical stuff using third-party tools is now better than ever, right? I'm
Yeah.
thinking specifically of like Stitch, Fivetran, like a lot of these services that make engineering tasks like you just kind of outsource the expertise to a tool. And yet we do see these like non-technical roles like sort of, really being tugged in this more technical direction. What do you think that's about?
It's an interesting question. Part of it, I think, is just that there's such a like a superpower that comes with understanding kind of how computers work and not at like the base level, just understanding that like you can use a computer to automate some things. And once you open that door, it kind of opens your eyes to the possibilities of what you can do. And I think we're seeing a lot of tech companies grow really quick and gain these huge market shares, whether deserved or not, based on their kind of technical ability.
Right.
Um, and there's also like this shift towards cloud vendors and managed services, and those tools are great, but then you want to start kind of connecting them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't know. I think it's just a general trend that software is kind of eating the world, and
Right.
more people are becoming tech literate. Even my grandma has an iPhone and she's doing pretty well with it. And once you can really connect with somebody, I think it's this just came to my brain. Part of it also too is a little bit of evangelism on kind of the tech side.
Yeah.
When an engineer or technical analyst or just somebody who's more comfortable with computers is able to be empathetic with somebody who is less technical and can kind of say like, hey, I noticed that you're doing something that is very repetitive, is something that computers can understand, like you're doing data entry. Like I can show you how to automate this, and I can write this whatever thing in 5 minutes, and it's going to save you an hour. And then I can teach you how to do that. So that's part of it. I think there's just a lot of opportunity to automate things that
Yeah.
people don't realize. But then too, like, from a purely like capitalistic perspective, like having these technical skills, you generally are more likely to get paid more. And so there's interest drawing people towards that as well.
Right.
And
Right.
if you can have engineer after your title, that you're probably going to be paid more. So if it's a support engineer or whatever.
Right.
So I think that's part of it. Just
I
I
dig
don't
that.
know. Computers are awesome. That's why I'm
Yeah.
an engineer at heart, and chemical engineering was cool. But then once I got to play with computers a lot, I was like, oh, computers are really cool. They're not irreducibly complex. Like in theory, you can understand everything about a computer and how it works. In reality, probably not. But it's like for me,
Yeah.
it gives like such a sense of confidence that at the end of the day, it's just ones and zeros kind of flipping around in there. And if I just spend enough time, I could break it all down, you know?
Yeah, it's just all ifs, you know.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So okay. So we're talking about the sort of import and sort of growth in the technical skill space. Okay. We're talking a little bit about like this like data ops idea. We're talking about the challenge of hiring. When you think back, especially in just like the last year or so, like and looking at the folks you've spoken with and DBT community and sort of all over, like what do you see right now as the big sort of common hurdles that data teams are facing, right? Like what are the problems that we kind of all seem to have and we're all kind of trying to figure out as a community?
Oh, that's interesting. Um, I don't know. I think my answer might be a little bit biased. I, I, I think that the new problem now is kind of evident in just what's happened really in 2019, especially like a ton of acquisitions around the BI space. Um, so people see the value there. A lot of new startups around the kind of the orchestration space. So that's clearly speaking to some sort of pain point there. Um, I, I think what people are struggling with is like there's very there's bespoke tools for solving some problems, and now they're struggling with some of the same things that like DevOps engineers or software engineers went through previously, where it's like, oh, I'm stringing all these tools together. Wow, that's a pain because now I'm creating a ton of complexity. And I wish there was something that made it simpler. There was a better mental model, but better framework for this stuff. Um, I think that there's been a recognition of the amplifier that data teams can actually be, like good analytics, good decision intelligence, business intelligence, but also like good predictive um, tooling or around your product or your data or just what your business is doing.
Yeah.
Um, and that it can really be, if you hire good people and give them the resources, they can be really good drivers of change, and if done in a way that's transparent and honest and not like, manipulative and all that. So I think there's uh, some of the pain points that like GitLab, the company, is trying to solve for engineers. Um, it's that mindset that those pains are slowly encroaching on like data teams and other more technical teams, maybe like security teams or support teams. Um, and at some point, I feel like at some point, basically, I don't know, like all a data team really is kind of is all data is like surveillance essentially. That sounds kind of weird, but like if you think about it, like NetSuite
Huh.
is a tool for tracking all of your financial things. Salesforce is a tool for tracking all your salespeople and then all your opportunities. Zora is for subscriptions, and it's all sort of surveillance. And the data team there is telling you what's going on across these different systems and doing all that data integration. And it's like at the end of the day, like I feel like a great state is when you can see like your business moving in conjunction kind of with the code. And I think what I mean by that is like, I've got jobs that are taking data from here, from where my salespeople are doing, and it's feeding data for what my marketing people are doing. And I understand all how that's happening because it's like documented in code. Um, yeah, that's kind of a rambly thought, but
Yeah, that's almost like meta surveillance, right? Like you want
yeah.
to have that next level of observation. That's interesting. Yeah, yeah, there's a lot to think about there. For sure. I'm right there with you. Yeah. Um, yeah, and one of the last things I kind of wanted to touch on and kind of chat about is just kind of thinking about, we've talked about like sort of how you got started and what your journey's been so far. And I'm wondering now, like, how you're thinking about what the next 6 months, what the next 2 or 3 years is going to look like for you. Like, what resources are you using to level yourself up? Do you have any like books or podcasts that you really enjoy? Like, both how you yourself are improving and how you'd recommend others to kind of do the same.
Yeah. Um, so there's several things. Being a relatively new father, I have limited time for a ton of like hacking on the weekend to build specific skills. So I have to be like a lot better about paying attention to certain things and listening to kind of that gut intuition about like, oh, this is hitting on something important. Um, I listen to the data engineering podcast quite a bit. Tobias Macy, I think he does a great job of finding interesting people and getting them to share their story really well. Being part of DBT Slack community, locally optimistic Slack community, I think connects me to a lot of thought leaders that either write things or share different articles that people have written. It's also interesting to read the questions that people are asking, because it highlights the pain points that other people have. Because naturally, I work at one organization. I'm not like a consultant, so my views are kind of biased, and that's a window into another world of like, oh, there's like other classes of problems, and so paying attention to that, I think, is important. There's a bunch of email newsletters that I subscribe to that I really like. There's Data Elixir, Data Science Weekly, Python Weekly, Data Eng Weekly, SF Data Weekly, or something like that. All these links, I think, are in the GitLab Data Team
Okay.
project as well. So there's a ton more resources in there. And also, I just work with some awesome people who they read their own things and they share things that they think are valuable for the rest of the team. And for me, like professionally too, so those are like things that I'm ingesting and reading. Thinking forward, I think about like, what are the things that I want to be doing on a day-to-day basis. And for me right now, it's pretty simple. During my day job, I'm happiest, I've noticed, when I get to solve problems and program in Python mainly, or do some SQL. I do love SQL. I've got my little SQL mug right here.
Oh, wow.
But I eventually know that it's very simple. Like, I just want to program more right now. There's no specific tools or anything that I'm like itchy to work on. I think we've just got enough problems at GitLab to solve and work on and keep me happy for a while.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think eventually I want to move back into management, because I think helping people grow is awesome, and I get to do a little bit of that via code reviews and kind of working with my peers. But eventually I'll make that switch back.
Yeah, I totally get that. I totally dig that. We're coming up on the hour, and I don't want to like rush through the end, right? Is there anything that you really want to talk about? Like, is there anything else that we can hash out? Is there anything we've like missed here? Do you want to give any shout outs? Also, for
Sure.
folks who are on the call, if you have any questions you want to ask, please use the chat function right here in the Zoom. That would be awesome.
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little briefly. The kind of the data ops moniker.
Yeah.
That was super interesting to see and think about, because I think maybe it was like 2017 is when it really like first appeared on the Gartner hype cycle. And for me, it was like, oh wow, data ops. This is actually something I'm very kind of into. I've never caught anything as it just appears on the hype cycle, and you get to kind of follow it along, which is kind of fun and exciting. But of course, what does it mean? It's data ops, short for data operations. I think that is like the catch-all buzzword for DevOps for data teams. And I think actually a really good resource around this is the folks at, is it the Data Kitchen, I think if you look for like Data Ops Cookbook, they've written a lot kind of about this philosophy, and they have like 10 or 14 different points around just kind of what data ops means. But a lot of it is version controlling, separate environments, a lot of change management type things. There's a lot of overlap with the work that we're doing at GitLab, I think. So I think it's cool, and I'm curious to understand. I like data ops as a thing in the abstract, and I'm just curious to see how the community evolves, what that actually means, and what that looks like in reality for different organizations, different types and scales of data. Because I really don't know. I think for us, it means data ops means we're using GitLab to control our environment, and we're using merge requests, and we've got CI jobs and all that fun stuff. But what does it mean for other organizations? Yeah, and as far as shout outs, I would be remiss if I did not thank Emily Shario for recommending me for this. She is one of my best connections to the data world, and she's a fantastic engineer on the team. Yeah, and obviously the DPT and LO communities, because I think that's the only reason I'm here today.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Huge thanks to Emily as well. Yeah, she was a big advocate. She did not undersell. You've really done a wonderful job, and I really appreciate it. This is giving me a lot to think about. You've probably seen me like looking down, taking furious notes here. Yeah, Taylor, thank you so much. This is so awesome. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to have talked with you. Like, this is awesome.
Thanks for bringing me on. It's a lot of fun.
As always, thanks to Scott and everybody else at Locally Optimistic for sponsoring these talks. I'm Simon Ouderkirk, WordPress.com. I'm on Twitter. Taylor Murphy, GitLab. You're on Twitter too.
I am.
Okay, awesome. Thanks Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay.